Thank you for choosing this Analyst Insight podcast from the Information Security Forum. I'm Paul Holland, and today I'll be talking about Zero Trust with Jordon Kelly. So Jordon, your current research project is on Zero Trust. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the project?
Hi Paul, yeah, sure. So at the moment, the ISF has recently started doing our research around the topic of Zero Trust, as you say. And this podcast, I guess, is a little bit about explaining some of the content that we're looking at putting into the paper and why we've come to the conclusions that we have. So this is a little bit about giving members some more insight into what Zero Trust is, how it can be implemented within their organization, and really where Zero Trust started, both as a concept and why we have it today in information security, and why it's such a big deal, given that it's now roughly 11 years old. If I start from the beginning, the framework for this paper is actually based around our forward work program that the ISF conduct, whereby we get ideas and concepts from our membership, and then we look at research that they would like us to start developing. So Zero Trust is a very hot topic within our recent forward work program criteria, and as a result, obviously now we're starting to look at that topic in more detail. So on a high level basis, what we understood after doing sort of roughly a month of research now is that Zero Trust is very complicated in that there's a lot of material out there on the internet at the moment regarding the topic, and there's a lot of different views from vendors, security experts, business executives, and so forth. So one of the fundamental points we felt was important for this paper was to really narrow down and understand what we mean when we're talking about Zero Trust. And what we sort of decided on, based on the information that's out there, is that Zero Trust actually falls into the category of a concept-driven security strategy. So the idea is that Zero Trust is the answer to the information security question of preventing a breach into a system and the exfiltration of sensitive information out of that network. So if we start diving into that a little bit deeper, what we get is a high-level strategy, which is basically changing the mindset of the organization and moving away from what would be traditionally viewed as a perimeter-based network security approach, and start to look very much more at a data-centric approach that looks at different elements of the organization's data, assets, systems, and so forth. So what we then get here is the idea that securing this data fits into a very select group of criteria within the pillars of Zero Trust. And from there, we work down into what we would refer to as Zero Trust architecture. So it's how all those concepts come together to form the technical basis of your network. And then down from that, we then start looking at the technologies that are involved within that. So that's really a sort of a high-level idea of where Zero Trust is in terms of the paper. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a better idea.
Yeah, that does, certainly. So really looking at that then, Zero Trust isn't a technology, it's a strategy. So why do organisations need it?
So it's a really interesting conversation when we start talking about, as I mentioned, how we define Zero Trust. But as you've keenly pointed out there, that the idea that Zero Trust is a technology and can be bought off the shelf is one that's sort of a wide misconception within the marketplace at the moment. And I think it falls into the same category as lots of security solution areas, whereby many organizations coming into this particular subject think that it's something that you can literally go out, buy from a vendor, and it automatically makes you a Zero Trust organization. However, the reality is a little bit more complex in that in order for you to start initiating Zero Trust and to understand why you need it, you really need to understand the business aspects of security. So you need to start aligning security's practices and principles, processes, and technologies in line with the business, and working out what's key to the business, whether that's the mission objective, and then start working backwards into the type of assets that the business has and the points that we need to protect. So this becomes the Zero Trust Protect surface. So the reason we're sort of at this stage now in the time that we're in is one, because a lot of organizations have started moving, some in many cases entirely to the cloud, but certainly at portions of their business that's now in the cloud system. So what we're now seeing is a move away from a very flat network environment, and we're starting to move towards a very decentralized way of looking at things. So we have an increasing number of devices, we have an increasing number of individuals, and we have an increasing number of locations whereby network traffic is all moving. So what this means is that looking at security from a perimeter perspective is no longer suitable for the way that businesses conduct business. We start to look at methodologies around agile, we start talking about moving on to specific devices such as mobile phones, individual computers, and even with COVID now, your home networks. So what we get is a very decentralized picture of how the network now exists. So really in the last couple of years, and especially given COVID in the last year, the arrival of zero trust is sort of very much almost an essential point of how security should be evolving going forward. So we're now sort of seeing that all of these different devices, individual users, and locations all need protecting. And as a result, we then start looking at the key pillars of the zero trust framework. So we start looking at defining the outcome, as I spoke about in terms of the business. We look at protecting from the inside out. So this is the development of your protected surfaces, whereby data is then looked at and you create a perimeter adjacent to that data, those assets, resources, etc. And then you start talking about how those assets have determined access. So it's looking at the technologies within the Zero Trust network that can then be used to start protecting those particular pieces of DAS resource. So what you then start looking at is access management. You start looking at inspection and logging tools. We start talking about multi-factor authentication and alike. So lots of these different technologies and different concepts start coming into play very much in their own now. The zero trust is very much a priority for organizations. So we then sort of start looking at defining a protect surface and understanding what data and what resources are critical to the business, and then moving on to how you map those transaction flows across the network, looking not only at the data or the resource in situ, but also how it moves across that network environment. And this is very much where your architecture and network pieces come into play, and the creation of your zero trust policies. So these are the policies that you apply at a layer 7 point, and what they basically work on is how that access to that particular resource is defined. And the idea of zero trust works very much on the principle of minimum privilege access. So it's not to say that people aren't trusted, it's more to say that people are given access to the resources that they need in order to complete their job role. So you don't give them any more or less than what's required of them. And this very much eliminates one of the key aspects of the human factor within security. And that is that we're all very aware that people make mistakes and errors occur. So by reducing the likelihood of errors occurring, we give it very much more of a secure environment. And this can obviously be done by giving access to specific resources that are required for the job. And this is very much a flexible process by which the technologies within Zero Trust actually allow you to alter the access depending on the project or the person or even the level of function that team or individual are at. So what you get is an environment that allows you to have minimum privilege access to a particular resource. And then if different access is required, a new policy statement is created and access is given or refused based on the criteria being met. So that's really, again, a little bit of a breakdown as to why we're starting to need more zero trust security practices in place. And I hope that gives you a little bit more of an idea around how we've moved from a particular network specific and perimeter based security down to how we're looking at zero trust now.
Yeah, there's some really good insights there. I mean, just thinking that through, the minimum access there sounds very similar to kind of the role-based access controls. And certainly, there's many organisations out there that have struggled to implement role-based access. So does that mean zero trust isn't necessarily for everybody?
The interesting thing with zero trust, I think, is instead of looking at it from the basis that it's not necessarily for everybody, it's the idea that zero trust is very much tailored to the context of the organisation. So what you start to see is zero trust doesn't have to be implemented across an entire organisation all at once. You can very much start looking at a crawl, walk, run process. So it's the idea of identifying, sort of understanding zero trust first within your organisation, and then identifying smaller assets or smaller resources within your network that you can then start to build zero trust into before you start working your way up to effectively the crown jewels. So these are the very specific points of security that are required around major and critical assets for an organization. So the idea that zero trust is not for everyone is a little bit of a misnomer, in that it's very much how you approach zero trust within the context of your organization, whether that means you start small and work your way up to something bigger, or whether it means that you actually have the expertise surrounding your organization as it is, whether that's network experts or additional staff in development departments and even security and information functions. that can start looking at how you can start tailoring zero trust to very specific points within the organization to help you then manage expectations, but also create the security around the resources that you need based on your ability to deal with that kind of setup in the zero trust environment.
Okay, no. So from what you're saying then, so zero trust is not a quick fix then, is it?
So this is one of the big points around zero trust. Again, it's very much in line with a lot of big security points we're now sort of seeing developing in the industry, and it's the commitment to something a little bit more long term. And to use that wonderful marketing phrase, zero trust very much is a journey point. It's not about reaching your peak zero trust situation, because what we actually see is the environment of a business is so dynamic and varied that the likelihood is that it's going to change very rapidly. And because of this, you're always going to start to look at zero trust being added to additional pieces as they come into the organization, as they come into the business, and then sort of applying zero trust principles and zero trust technologies and alike to those specific additions to the network. So what I'm sort of getting at there is a little bit more around how zero trust basically needs to be considered on a continuous basis. So it's almost like our DevSecOps point now. It's a continuous cycle whereby at every point you have to go back and make sure that everything within the network you've got has been zero trusted where required. And then anything that has been added additionally needs to then have that same process applied to it. So whilst we understand that for a lot of organizations, it may be quite daunting to see zero trust as a continuous requirement, what we are sort of saying again is that can be done very much on an incremental basis, and it can be done in the context of the organization to suit the parameters and requirements of the running of the business at the time. So I guess in essence, what we're sort of saying there is no, it's not a quick fix, but I don't believe anything in security is ever a quick fix. So I think one of the things organizations need to think about going into this is very much around the planning and identifying what needs to be secured as a matter of urgency and what maybe can be left behind to deal with a little bit later. And in some cases, there's even the option to say there'll be bits of data or resources within the organization that are actually quite happily secured through more basic security hygiene methods and don't actually require zero trust at all.
Okay, no, thanks for that. I found that really interesting, Jordon, and really appreciate your time in explaining everything. But I mean, certainly this is something I'm going to look forward to reading when it's released. Is there any kind of final comments, though, you wanted to pass on before we finish?
I think the big one from my perspective is really helping ISF members and those that will be reading the paper get a better grip of what zero trust is as a concept on a whole level. So looking at that strategy piece and then really working down the layers to sort of talk about how we have zero trust as a strategy, which then gets implemented through zero trust architecture. And then we start looking at the technologies that exist already, but might exist in the future that will start to help benefit zero trust as an environment. So we talk about things like our multi-factor authentication, the greater adoption of cloud. We look at software-defined perimeters. We look at entity and user behavior. And we also look at sort of concepts around more mature organizations who start to adopt things like blockchain and technologies like to sort of give that extra layer of security on top of their zero trust.
Oh, great, thanks. All right, well, thanks for listening. And you can find more podcasts on the ISF podcast channel or at securityforum.org, where you can also learn more about ISF research, our tools and guidance.